in. But in the meantime, I do have a little bit of introductory remarks. So I'm going to get started with that and to be respectful of Katie's time. So good afternoon, I'm Amy Snyder from the Connect and Communicate Series Planning Committee. So thank you for joining us for the Connect and Communicate series presenting how to build an engaging library workshop. This discussion is being recorded and will be made available to the Pennsylvania Library Association College and Research Division members through the PALA website, as well as sent to registrants and available on the CRD blog. For this discussion, you will only need a headset or speakers. You should also see that Zoom's live transcription feature is turned on for closed captioning during this session. We encourage you to ask questions in the chat box at the bottom right throughout the discussion, and we'll attempt to include your questions as appropriate during the session or at the end. We'll also do our best to assist participants with technical issues. Please post those issues in the chat box as well. This session is brought to you by the Pennsylvania Library Association's College and Research Division's Connect and Communicate series. I'd like to thank the CRD board for supporting the Connect and Communicate initiative and the other Connect and Communicate Planning Committee members, including Adam Balchosniff, Rana Lisioko, Christy Aldelman-Ritter, myself, and Diane Porterfield, who is helping with the technical aspects of today's session. Please contact any one of the team for information about becoming a PALA member. This project is made possible by a grant from the Institute of Museum and Library Services, as administered by the Pennsylvania Department of Education through the Office of Commonwealth Libraries and the Commonwealth of Pennsylvania Tom Wolf's Governor. And finally, I'd like to thank and introduce our presenter for today's event. Katie Odeher is a reference and instruction librarian at Penn State Abington, where she teaches information literacy and helps plan and run programming as a member of the library outreach team. And with that, I'd like to welcome and turn the presentation over to Katie, sorry.
No worries. Thank you, Amy. And thank you to everyone in the division for inviting me to speak. I'm really excited to speak with you guys about creating an engaging library workshop. So I'm going to share my screen now. All right. And I'm going to attempt to keep my eye on the chat, but if I don't respond to you, I may save things to the end. But hopefully we can make this on theme in terms of an engaging workshop. And I'd love to respond to things as you post them if it's relevant. So I'll be trying to keep my eye on the chat. So with that being said, today we're going to discuss how can you plan for an engaging workshop. So thinking about frameworks to consider and specific activities and technologies to plan for. And then on looking more big picture, how can you assess the outcomes? And I'm going to sneak in some tips for marketing at the end. So if you're not familiar with our campus, I'm a librarian at Penn State Abington, which is about 30 minutes outside of Philadelphia. We're one of the larger Penn State campuses with around 3,500 undergraduate students. So we're an undergraduate campus, and we're also a very diverse campus with more than 50% students of color. Something else to know about this workshop is that I sort of planned it based on a series of workshops that we had done in fall of 2020 and spring of 2021. So many of the workshops were virtual, and I'm going to be addressing virtual aspects to creating an engaging workshop, but also some of these workshops I've run again in person this semester. So that's kind of an interesting comparison, and I hope to talk about in-person workshops as well. And I wanted to start by getting a sense of all of you, what your experiences with workshops are, because I think that will be an interesting discussion to just kick off our presentation here and to learn more about where you're coming from. So if you're not familiar with it, I'm going to use a poll everywhere poll to just get a sense of your experiences. And this is a technology I really like. And it's one of the things, it's sort of a meta, one of the things I'm going to talk about. So I've just posted a link in the chat to my poll everywhere, and that should take you to a screen which allows you to basically respond to a question. I think it asks you to log in, which you don't have, to put your name, you don't have to do that. Feel free to skip. I'm just interested in hearing what your experiences are. Okay, looks like results are settling, and most people have occasionally taught a workshop, but we have also a range of experience. Some people, it looks like you teach often, and some not often at all. So great. The second thing I'd like to gauge from you and learn from you is, in your view, what makes a workshop engaging? So maybe what are some engaging activities you've used in a workshop before, or what are some ideas you have around that? Because that's what we're going to talk about today. So I'll wait a couple minutes for people to respond. Oh, these are so great. So feel free to keep posting, and I'm going to just chat while people keep posting their responses. I'm seeing some themes here, which are definitely interaction and participation have been coming up in a lot of people's responses. And yeah, I definitely would say that's an indicator of an engaging workshop. Also, a bunch of people have commented on something having to do with application or it being meaningful. And I would definitely agree that those are a big part of engagement, or it being relevant. I see the word relevant coming up a few times. Great. Well, thank you for sharing that. Good baseline. Pull us back to our presentation here. So I was thinking about a lot of similar experiences to what you all shared when I was preparing for this workshop. And I decided to look up a definition for engage because that's always a good starting point. And I found a couple. One is to engage, to attract or keep someone's attention. So we talk about engaging someone's interest or engaging their attention. So this is kind of like the fireworks, the exciting things that bring people in, that grab people's attention. I also saw the definition to participate or become involved in. So when we think of engaging in conversations, participation, engaging in activities. So that's another aspect of engagement. And the final definition I was finding or thinking about is engaging in the sense of like gears engaging with one another. So to become meshed or interlocked. And to me, this really captures that application side, that we want to promote content, promote workshops that really ask students in a meaningful way to engage with what we're teaching in their studies, in their life outside of their studies. So to me, engagement really encompasses all of those three things. But part of planning for that kind of engagement of all types is thinking about who are we engaging. So in my context, and what I'm mostly going to be speaking about today, students are the primary audience. Sometimes we teach workshops to faculty, but the workshops I've taught have been students. Some people here may be at a non-academic institution. So I'm still going to frame things in terms of students a lot, and you may just want to translate that in your mind to how it would work for your institution. But even within some sort of monolithic group like student or faculty or staff, I really think it's important to think about, what is the diversity of experience among that group? So I may have participants who have a native language that is not English, participants who are bringing different experiences and cultural backgrounds to the table, participants who maybe have a disability. And keeping those things in mind when I'm planning is really going to help me make that an engaging workshop. So one useful framework to think about this is the Universal Design for Learning. So if you're not familiar with this framework, it's an educational framework which provides guidance for inclusive teaching practices. So when I'm thinking about engaging that diverse audience of students or faculty members or whoever my audience is, some of these guidelines that are provided in this framework are really helpful for coming up with an engagement strategy that allows people who have lots of different experiences, maybe different challenges, different strengths, to engage in a way that is useful to the whole. So some examples of guidelines include optimize individual choice and autonomy, heighten salience of goals and objectives, and foster collaboration in community. And as I talk about different activities that I have found really useful in preparing engaging workshops, I just want to highlight some of those guidelines as I go that really provide a good framing for me to make my activities more engaging. So step one, planning your workshop content. I like to start by creating learning objectives. So a learning objective is when you're thinking about that goal that you want your audience to be able to achieve by the end of the workshop. And I'm sure many of you are familiar with this concept of learning objectives. And I know for me, occasionally it falls by the wayside. Maybe I'm planning really last minute, or maybe it's a topic that I feel very confident and versant in that topic. And so I just think, I don't need learning objectives this time. But I find that when I really do take that time to create a clear and measurable learning objective, it drives my engagement activities. So when we're thinking about creating a truly engaging workshop, learning objectives are a really important first step. So if I'm framing it in terms of, what will participants be able to do? So an example would be participants will be able to consult evidence-based sources of health information. This was a learning objective from a Health in the Headlines workshop that I taught last year. And framing it this way helps me think, okay, in my workshop, I want to create some sort of activity that will ask students to do this, to meet this objective, so that I can see, did they really, will they really be able to apply these concepts? So it can help get me start thinking about what kind of activities can I plan to meet these objectives. Oops. Go back here. And you'll see on the right there, Bloom's taxonomy, which is a set of verbs which you can use to create learning objectives. And this helps make it a really specific and measurable outcome. So for instance, sometimes I'm tempted to frame my learning objectives in terms of students will understand or students will learn about this. But I'd like to pull up Bloom's taxonomy to remind myself, how can I use a verb or a word that is really measurable? So if I frame it instead as identify rather than they will know, then that's something I can measure with a quiz or fun activity where they have to identify a particular concept or select from among choices. Then I'm able to measure that activity. And it also helps, if I'm planning an objective before I get to planning the activity, then it helps me think, okay, how can I create that activity? And it's much easier to create an activity based on a concrete verb from Bloom's taxonomy than it is from a more vague term like learn or know, which is easier to use in the abstract when we're not thinking about the concrete application. So usually once I've moved through my learning objectives, my next thought is, okay, how am I going to structure this workshop generally? And I personally really like to structure in terms of at least 3 activities. So a warmer activity at the beginning, some sort of reflection or discussion activity, and finally an application activity. And I wasn't even thinking about this when I started preparing, but I realized that that lines up pretty well with our 3 definitions of engagement from the beginning. So you want something that is exciting, that grabs students' attention, that brings them in. You want a really participatory conversation, engaging and thinking and talking and sharing within the context of the workshop. And you want something that engages in a meaningful way with their lives, that allows them to walk away with a skill they can really apply. So I want to talk about each of these in sequence. Warmer activities are really valuable in that they encourage participants to connect the workshop to their prior knowledge. And I guess depending on how you design your warmer activity, but I like to design mine in terms of, what are your previous experiences on this topic, or what do you already know? This ties into the universal design for learning, in that it's helping students to see how relevant this could be, see the value, and also see the topic of the workshop in an authentic, true setting for them. And not only is it helpful to gauge that prior knowledge in terms of connecting students to their lives, it's also useful for me as an instructor, because I can gauge how much participants already know about this topic, and I can maybe determine why they've come, which is really useful in how I might orient some of the ideas when I'm actually giving the workshop. And again, it should be something that's attention grabbing and not too high stakes, because especially in a setting where people maybe don't know the others that they're attending the workshop with, they may not be willing to put out all the participation right away. So having some sort of gentle entry and people who get to know each other a little bit is really useful. So here are a few example warmer activities that I've done in the past. Pull Everywhere you experienced today already. It's a really great tool. It's a free website where you can create an account. It includes anonymous free response features, which you already saw, polls. Something that also impresses me about Pull Everywhere is that they're constantly developing. So I find that, they've implemented new quiz game features that are actually modeled after Kahoot, which I'm going to talk about next. So I might use a poll to do something like engage with where they are. So up on the upper left from my Health in the Headlines workshop, I had them answer the question, where do you usually get your health related news? So that could sort of start our conversation. Kahoot up there on the right is also a fun way to really draw them in. If you're not familiar with Kahoot, it's an education website platform that's also free, where you can create quiz style games. And students, at least our students at Penn State Abington, are familiar with this technology. Many of them have used it in high school. It has an app, so a lot of them already have the app on their phone, and they find it highly engaging. I pull up a Kahoot and students will be like, yes, it's a Kahoot, I can't wait. The other fun thing about a Kahoot, though not very realistic, somehow the platform always makes it so that there is a winner. I think it has to do maybe with speed of response within a group, that they've gotten all the answers correct. The person who answered correctly the quickest will come out as the winner in the end, which can be fun if you want to offer some sort of a prize. It makes it really easy to distinguish between different people. And as you can see, I will use this again as a way to gauge students' knowledge or attitudes. So the example here on the slide, I was giving a workshop on Google. So you think you can Google. And I asked students, whether they thought search engines are neutral and objective providers of information. So that can lead us into a discussion about algorithmic bias, and get a sense for, are the students already aware of that or not? And finally, a discussion can be a good way to kick off activities. And I find with Pull Everywhere and Kahoot, they work really well online. They also work really well in person. Discussions, in my experience, don't work as well in person, online, because people maybe have a little more of a barrier in engaging immediately when they're in a virtual setting. So in this case, I may not choose an activity like that for a virtual setting, but I find students in the transition back to in-person learning at our campus, students seemed really eager to engage in this more physical way. So I've actually prioritized in-person discussions in my more recent workshops, and students seem to really enjoy that. After so long of relying on technology to interact with one another, there can be something really great about just having a conversation. So generally, after a warmer activity, I will move into some sort of presentation about core ideas that are maybe more abstract, but important knowledge bases for whatever skill I'm hoping to teach. And once I've done that presentation, I like to break it up by giving another activity. So an activity that I think works really well after a presentation is some sort of reflection. Could also be a discussion. because this provides a good transition from that presentation stage or a more concrete learning stage towards application. Allows the participants to think about how what they just learned could apply in their lives. And this again ties back to those guidelines from the Universal Design for Learning, where you want to heighten and really highlight how are these things we're talking about salient or relevant to you, to your goals. So thinking back to, okay, discussions maybe don't work that well online. One workaround I found is Padlet. So Padlet is, and Padlet.com is a website, which is again a free tool, and it provides a way to facilitate reflection or discussion activities in that it's a site that allows you to post sticky notes, kind of virtual sticky notes. So I can ask a question like, where or when do you tend to encounter health news that seems sensational? And students can reply first in writing on the Padlet, and then I can lead that into saying, oh, you know, I see a lot of people, I see this theme, that's really interesting. Do we want to comment on that? And that often empowers people to unmute and actually talk. Oh, and if they don't, you know, at least we've still all seen it, and I can get a sense for what people are thinking about. As I was just saying, adding a discussion to a reflection can be really useful. So in an in-person setting, I might style it more as a think, pair, share activity, where I have students reflect on it, talk with a partner, and then share out to the whole group. Another thing you can try is having students write down their thoughts on a note card and then share it with a group. Or even in person, you could use a Padlet. And I think the value in structuring a discussion in this way is that it helps boost student confidence, where they can really get a sense of clearly articulating an idea and, okay, yes, this is a good idea, I can talk about this. It also makes conversations more inclusive for participants who are not native English speakers. Often that language barrier might make students feel more reluctant to voice their perspectives in just a purely discussion setting. But if they have that opportunity to slow down and think, clearly articulate and write out responses, then they will often feel more willing to engage in that conversation. This similarly applies to students who have disabilities. And really, I think it's beneficial to everyone to have that extra thinking space so that you can feel more confident engaging in discussion. So there you see another sample discussion question I had in one of my workshops. A third activity that I would do at this point after doing an initial presentation is a Skillshare activity. This is particularly good when you have students or participants of different skill levels or people with different experience who are engaging with the topic, because it places value on participants' knowledge. And for instance, in this context, I was teaching a workshop on Google, and I anticipated that we may have students who are already quite facile with using Google and are already familiar with that technology, clearly. We also have a very large information technology major at my campus. So I was thinking, oh, maybe we'll get some of those students. And having an activity like this allows students who do feel very confident and competent in the area to feel like they're contributing something to the discussion. And again, you could do that in physical sticky notes if it's in a class. You could do it online on a Padlet, either physically or if you're in a virtual setting, that works really well. And I found that students at all levels, students who are very confident and competent in the topic, students who don't know that much but maybe have a different perspective, they all seem to really enjoy sharing things that they can bring to the table and learning from each other in that way. So after I've had a reflection activity or some sort of breather after the presentation section, I'll usually move into talking about, okay, we've talked about these abstract principles. Let's now talk about how you could apply this in real life. And so I'll spend some time maybe going through examples or more concrete things, and then I'll move on to a now you try kind of stage. So an application activity. And ideally, these should include some of that guided practice. And Something that I have struggled with in the past and that I now work really hard to get better at is making sure you don't run out of time and you have time for feedback, because that feedback at the end of an application activity is immensely valuable. And that also ties back to our Universal Design for Learning guidelines, where we want to increase mastery-oriented feedback and chances for application. So an example of how you might structure an application activity, going back to the Health in the Headlines workshop, some of my goals were to have students learn how to trace a news item related to health that was based on a scientific study back to the original scientific study and read about it in context. And also wanted them to be able to consult evidence-based sources, do some lateral searching, and learn more about this topic from different perspectives. So I had students go through an article, and I had a chart which allowed them to fill in for some of these different areas, skill areas, finding the original article, doing some lateral searching, looking to see what evidence-based sources said about this topic. And I've done this activity both in person and online, and it worked really well to have it be in a Google document. A couple of the benefits of that is that it's very easy to organize with breakout rooms. So if you can create one document like the one you see on the left, which has a listing of all the different options. And if you're in a Zoom setting, you can say, okay, breakout room 1, you're on article 1, breakout room 2, article 2, and then they can click on the link, which will take them over here on the right to a more detailed activity. And then we can come back together and discuss. In an in-person setting, I found that students, I asked them, do you want to do it on Google or would you rather do it these paper version? And they preferred to do it just on paper. So I like giving students options where I can, having that more autonomy. And I would say in my experiences so far this semester, students are really craving more of that physical experience. But I would say I have run these kinds of Google Doc collaboration document activities in person, and that works quite well too. Sometimes I've found I don't have the time to do an application activity that's really in depth. If you really structure those well, they can take some time for students to investigate a source or, apply various principles. So in some cases, it may be more appropriate to skip a true application activity and have something more, quicker and maybe less in depth. So if I'm not able to do an application activity, I'll generally at least try to structure an exit activity. And this is where I find, again, a Kahoot or some sort of quiz can be really fun. Some of our students especially enjoy the prospect of prizes. So again, Kahoot is great because there's always a winner. If you have a Kahoot, there's always a first, second, and third place winner. So that can be one way to get students really involved. Say, oh, there's a prize at the end. And this can also, allow you to have at least some evaluation of, did they achieve the learning objectives in terms of, are they able to answer these questions correctly? Right. So those are some basics on how you can structure engaging activities. Now I want to move on to talk about assessing your workshop outcomes. So if we're thinking about, assessment, I really think of it in two different ways. I don't think you need to have a formal assessment. So there's sort of informal assessment and formal assessment. I think there's a lot of value in just within a workshop, thinking about how did it go? So if you have structured a lot of engaging activities, you usually will have some sort of data left over. You'll have your poll everywhere where you see all the responses students gave. You'll have your Google Docs. Maybe you'll have physical worksheets if the students didn't take them with. And you can look at those and think about, did students achieve these learning objectives? Were the majority of students correct in their quiz answers? If they're not, okay, maybe I need to change something next time. Clearly students didn't quite meet those objectives. Even when you don't have some sort of physical takeaway to evaluate, just building in a little time after the workshop to reflect and write notes can be really helpful in terms of just doing your own assessment for internal purposes. However, there are cases in which I think having a more formal or standard or structured assessment is really useful. So I like to administer a standard post-workshop survey. Now, it can sometimes be challenging to get students to take such a survey. So when we were in the online environment, I liked to be able to advertise, we have prizes, and rather than give out prizes for, I guess prize is probably the wrong word, drawing maybe, rather than give out these incentives for participation within the workshop, I would say, okay, if you take this survey, you'll be entered for a drawing. So it was a way to get students coming to the workshop and feeling like they have fun things that they might get out of it, but also get some feedback for us. So administering these surveys, I find useful because it's a way to, rather than just assess within the context of that one workshop and those specific learning objectives, you can evaluate outcomes that are more broad. So you can look at all your workshops and say, what are the outcomes for our workshops generally? Or how have students, how do these two different workshops compare? Or maybe how do our workshops compare to our instruction sessions? So that's where having some sort of quantitative, 1 through 5 scale question for students to answer, or participants in general, can be a helpful way of creating the space for those comparisons. And of course, it's great to be able to gather some qualitative feedback as well. So one way that the way that I have found works really well for us for evaluating our workshops is using Project Outcome. So if you're not familiar with Project Outcome, it is a tool that is offered through ACRL, which is free to libraries to assess a variety of things. So you can use a Project Outcome survey to assess your instruction, your reference consultations, your events and programs, etc. And all of these, they're pre-built surveys, though they also let you adapt. You can add questions as well, but they're built to assess 4 different outcomes. How knowledgeable are students or participants coming out of the event? How confident are they? Do they plan to apply the skills? And how has this improved their awareness of library resources? And I really think those 4 outcomes are good and really interesting to measure. And not only are the outcomes good, but the tool itself provides you with a lot of analytical ability. So you can sort things easily, you can build reports. It's a really good way of being able to measure your impact. And you can say to your campus community, to your supervisor, look at the impact that we made. Students felt this much more confident coming out of workshops. And so I think that that's another good argument for assessment, showing your impact. In terms of some of our impacts at Abington, when I was thinking about using this assessment method, I was only thinking about internal purposes. So I don't feel comfortable offering you any really specific details from our surveys. But just in general terms, we've used Project Outcome both for instruction and for events. So I think it's been really interesting for me to compare those 2 modes of learning or teaching. Predictably, students came out slightly higher on the knowledge and application outcomes because our instruction sessions tend to be assignment focused. I think that makes a lot of sense. But for the workshops, students felt more confident. So confidence is in comparing the instruction in the workshops, confidence was much higher in the workshops. So I thought that really speaks to part of the purpose of workshops, or this kind of maybe less formal instruction or outside of class instruction can have a unique role in engaging students in terms of their feelings of confidence around different skills. We also, I'm seeing the question, is Project Outcome free? Yes, it is a free tool. And unlike a lot of these platforms, Kahoot, Pull Everywhere, etc., you can pay to get more. I believe with Project Outcome, I guess I can't say that with confidence, but we're using it for free, and it certainly covers all of our needs. I believe every aspect of it is free. Someone can correct me if that's not true. Yes, I believe you have to register for an account. In terms of qualitative feedback, Project Outcome also lets you tailor the questions you ask. So I think their standard question is, what did you like about this program? So we did have that question, and the themes that came up were people really liked, these were the 4 themes I saw, and 3 of them relate to engagement or interactivity. So people mentioned a lot, I love it when it's interactive. They mentioned things about applications. So they liked it when they said, oh, I will definitely apply these tips to my next Google search, or I know that I'm going to use this to evaluate the news. A lot of students brought up application centered, takeaways that they really liked. They also really liked it being student centered in terms of, I guess, if your audience is not student, you could just say participant centered. Same principle. They really liked it when their own experiences were made central. The Skillshare activity was quite popular. Students liked being able to, having that value placed on their knowledge. So that is a theme that came up. And people commented on like, oh, this is great, I didn't know this, great information. So that was another theme. But I was amazed to see that almost all of the what did you like about this program referred to those engagement aspects. So the one last thing I wanted to touch on is marketing your workshop. And I will say I'm not a marketing expert, but I'll talk a little bit about our experiences and what's worked for us. One top tip is don't rely on students reading email. Actually, at our institution, we don't have access to any sort of student listserv, so this is almost not relevant, but a lot of feedback I hear from students and faculty is that students really don't read emails. So that's not a great way to reach them. And I would recommend just finding out where are students getting their information. So we have a really great student engagement department unit on campus, and they run a website called Engage, where student groups, faculty groups, everyone posts their events. And they have pretty good engagement on that platform. So students will look there. They also, the student engagement unit coordinates flyer posting throughout the campus. And that I've heard, anecdotally, students will always say, oh, I saw the flyer and that's how I knew to come. So flyers on our campus work really well. I've never had a student say that they came because they saw it on social media. We do post about our events on Instagram and on Facebook, more for a faculty audience on Facebook. But I don't think that that's drawing in the crowds. I think seeing, learning more about your campus or your institution and where people go for information among your population would be really useful, because we've had success with flyers, which is the sort of established knowledge of the campus. However, the thing that really brings in the most students, the most participants, is relationships. So if I speak to students I know on campus, our student workers, people in different organizations student organizations we work with, and talk up our events, that often generates people coming. Collaborating with faculty is a big one. We have access to a faculty listserv, so often I'll send out an email that not only shows the flyer, but also gives the learning objectives for the workshop. And faculty seem to like that. And often that brings in faculty members whose fields are related to the workshop. So for the Health in the Headlines workshop, I had a lot of faculty members in the health related professions offer extra credit for students for coming. And extra credit is always a great draw. And I think it's those relationships, having students who have relationships with their professors bring them in. So any way you can maximize drawing on relationships to get people to come can really help. So those are the main points I wanted to give today. And, I hope it seems like we have some time now for discussion or questions. And if you have any questions that you think of later, also my email is right here. So I'm going to put that in the chat and then stop sharing. and take questions.
Katie, do you want to take our questions via chat or do we ask them?
Either way is fine with me.
I was just wondering if you use that Engage website at your campus to advertise your library workshops and if that's successful.
We do use Engage to advertise our workshops, and I think it has been fairly successful. The nice thing about Engage is that that's where our freshman seminar students are all directed. They're required to attend a certain number of events on campus per semester. And so that's where they're sort of taught to go. And so it's really beneficial to us to have our events up there because we know that there's that sort of automatic potential audience that's looking on that platform.
That's helpful. We don't have anything like that at our campus, although I do see they're coming out and piloting an engagement app for students. So that could be helpful. I don't know if that platform that you're using is something that your campus pays for, because if not, I don't know why we're not using it. Thanks.
Yeah, no problem. It's a good question as to whether it's paid or not. It's actually new this year, and it's a website, but it's also app-based. So a lot of students do have the app. I'm seeing a question from Christy. Do you do anything different between structuring workshops and structuring information sessions or instruction sessions? That's a great question. I think for me it is different because often my instruction sessions are more based around assignments. So, well, yeah, I guess some similar principles may apply, but I guess I feel that I have maybe less autonomy in how I structure application activities, that I tend to make it very based on their assignment. So if they need to find, 3 scholarly sources, then I'll say, okay, now's the time in our class where we find a scholarly source. So I'd say it's probably pretty similar in how I structure them, but except that I would have less, maybe be a little more bounded in how I do it. I also see, what other workshops have you done? Which ones have been more popular? We run a fake news / misinformation workshop at our campus. So that I've run together with colleagues. And that has been quite popular. I think also because of that factor of tapping into classes where we've gotten media classes involved. So we've had as many as, 55 people, I think, attend one of our fake news workshops. So that's been quite popular. And I think that's another one where people really see the relevance of it. In terms of other workshops, we have some colleagues, Penn State colleagues at Penn State Berks, who have created several workshops around privacy, digital wellness, and if someone else might be able to think of the other one that they've created, but those have been really useful, really fun to run. And we've gotten not bad attendance at those. I think though that definitely the ones with more connections to the curriculum are the ones that get the biggest attendance. No problem. Any other questions?
Katie, if you're offering as kind of an incentive to attend, the fact that students might have to attend a certain number of events to fulfill some kind of first year requirement, is it up to you then as the person who has to take attendance and notify somebody of who attended, or how do you organize that?
Students generally are required to take a selfie. So no, I don't have to organize that other than posing for a selfie.
Oh, okay. I think that would be a good incentive, I think, because we don't have that either here. And it really, I've found that we really struggle when we even have really interesting, fun content for a workshop. Why would anybody want to come, really? If it's not extra credit, which sometimes we struggle with, even though it's engaging and fun, without some kind of incentive, I really don't know why they would want to come.
Yeah, that's a tricky one. I sometimes feel like the purist in me is like, oh, they should just come for the love of it. Like, but of course, the vast majority of students who do come are coming because of extra credit or because it's a requirement, or maybe because there's free food, though that has no longer, we're not offering free food right now at our events. So that's sort of not a factor right now. But I found for the students who have come outside of those incentives, a lot of them are students who are engaged in the library in different ways. People who come to our book club, or people who have come to our instruction sessions and gotten something out of that, and so that's brought them. So having those multiple points of contact can also really help bring people in my experience. Any other questions?
I'll ask a question. So are you still running workshops virtually? Are you doing a mixture of in-person and virtual, or how are you currently running things, and how has attendance been?
We're running mostly in person. So yeah, that's a great question. It's been a little tricky to figure out what is the best way to do it right now. Faculty-oriented events have definitely stayed on Zoom. So we have, in general at our campus, but that means that we would tend to, if it's a faculty-oriented event, we'll probably be on Zoom. The students at our campus seem to really be craving in-person contact. So I have definitely been making an effort to make them in person. Some of my colleagues have tried running hybrid, feeling like, okay, we want to offer in person, so it should be also, but we want to accommodate people who maybe can't come. So let's try to run this as a hybrid event. And I haven't gone there personally, just because a couple times in the remote learning period, I ran hybrid classes and found that to be a very challenging experience, where I felt like I couldn't really fully serve the population in person or the population online. So for me, I've been sticking to in-person workshops for student-oriented events.
Katie, this is Barb again. I've been using Project Outcome for all of our events. I've never used it for instruction, but I find it to be really helpful for events because it's short and it's a quick, really quick for students to fill out. And one of the questions is open-ended, like what other kinds of things would you like to see the library offer? And so we've gotten some good answers to that. So I would just endorse Project Outcome for an easy way to do a quick assessment.
Yeah, thanks, Barb.
We can certainly hang out and take any more questions, but if you do need to get somewhere else, I'm going to go ahead and make sure to thank Katie and thank all of you for joining us today. I hope you'll take a few minutes to complete our survey and let us know your thoughts about the presentation today and about our programming in general. So I just put a link to that survey in the chat box. As a reminder, the recording of this presentation will be available to PALA members through the PALA website. And if you're not a PALA member and you're interested in becoming a member, please feel free to email me. I'm going to throw my email in the chat box. And I'll have the appropriate person get in contact with you. I'd also invite you to contact me or any of our team if you have suggestions for future discussions and presentations. And I most definitely invite you to contact one of us if you'd be interested in presenting. So again, I'm happy to hang out. I'm guessing Katie's happy to hang out for a little bit here too to answer more questions. But if you all have somewhere you need to be, I totally respect that if you need to go.
Thank you, everyone. I'll stick around.